Hello, everyone, and welcome to another special edition of Sclc Votes. I'm Maynard Eaton, and our guest today is Aklima Kondaker, the Georgia State Director of All Voting is Local. Welcome, Ms. Kondaker. Thank you for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference has been at the forefront in obtaining and protecting a right to vote since our inception, dating back to our founding father, our founding president, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So this is something we've been doing since our inception. Ms. Kondaker, how long have you been doing this, and what is it that you do?
So I've been doing this work in Georgia since around 2015, 2016. I've worked with Leadership Conference and this campaign called All Voting is Local. And what All Voting is Local is all about is making sure that we break down barriers to the ballot so that we are pushing advocacy strategies, policy recommendations, and other critical points that we must meet to ensure that more people can access the ballot, whether that means making sure that voters have access to correct and updated information about their absentee ballots, or having drop boxes available in more locations. These are some of the areas where we have worked to make sure that more people can access the ballot, in particular people of color. So we have that focus here in the state. As you've laid out, I am the Georgia State Director, and that is what I'm focused on, the voters and our elections, and making sure that more people can equitably access the ballot.
It seems like voting this time around in this election is not only controversial, but frenzied. I mean, there seems to be a lot of activity, a lot of concerns about voting. How do you gauge the atmosphere this time around?
So I'm going to say that the concerns are valid. I wouldn't want any of the voters or any of the people who are seeing this or who are hearing this to believe that there are no issues with our election. There are issues. But I think that these issues come from a lot of different things that are all collected around this moment as we in the state of Georgia are collectively coming together to cast our ballots. So we know that we're in a pandemic. And since the pandemic started, we've had a lot of issues around figuring out what are the best ways for voters to cast their ballot. What are the safest ways to make sure that we have effective ballot delivery? With that, we know that this year, our state election board and our Secretary of State's office for the first time has approved ballot drop boxes. And how these ballot drop boxes are used are for safe and effective ballot delivery. So that is one change that I think a lot of voters either may not be aware of or might be confused by, because ballot drop boxes are not necessarily available to them where they live. We do have them in most counties, but we have about 31 counties that do not have drop boxes. I do want everybody to know, however, that absentee voting or voting by mail is still a safe and effective option, and it is still available to everyone right now. So if you have requested your absentee ballot and you have some concern about whether it's safe for you to deliver it via a drop box or through the mail, or you just have questions about it, let me assure you, this is a safe and effective method for ballot delivery. So if you do have your absentee ballot, you can go ahead and deliver it into a drop box. That is your one-to-one communication between you and your Board of Elections office, because they're the ones that are going to be collecting your ballots. Whereas if you were to put them in the mail, which is still an option for you to use, you do have to keep in mind that you may not have enough time for your Board of Elections to receive that. We do know that there have been a lot of delays with the mail, and a large part because of COVID-19, because what we've been seeing in the pandemic. So you can exercise that option, but do be clear and understand that it may take some time for that to be received. Now, if you're comfortable with going to your Board of Elections office with your absentee ballot, that is, of course, an option. You may physically bring that to your Board of Elections office for them to receive and count it in the same way that they would if you chose to vote in person. I do want to stress that early voting is happening right now in the state of Georgia. So if you have time available today, tomorrow, the day after, up until Friday, you can certainly still use that method to safely and effectively cast your ballot. So please commit to a voting plan, whether it is voting absentee or voting early during this period. And please be rest assured that though there are some kinks, we know that there are issues, your vote still matters and it will still count. So please, please make sure that you get out and vote.
Klima, if I may call you that, there's been a record early voting, has it not? I mean, this is unheard of heretofore. Am I correct with regard to the many people who are voting early? Does that suggest something about this campaign season?
Absolutely. I think that suggests that everyone wants to be more plugged in to their representation. Everybody wants to have a say in what they're seeing around them. I mean, one thing I talked about early on is this pandemic. This pandemic is disproportionately affecting people of color. People of color across the state are dying at higher rates as compared to anyone else. So we've really seen a rise, a surge in voting, not only overall throughout the entire population, but especially people of color. And this is because our lives are on the line during this election season. In the city of Atlanta, we know that our mayor has had mandates for masks to make sure that people who are out are protecting themselves and those around them to reduce the spread. But we know that that is not the case everywhere. There is no comprehensive guidance for the state of Georgia. There is no comprehensive guidance from the federal government. So where does that leave voters? Voters who are concerned because their family members, their friends are becoming sick. My mother is a first responder. She's a registered nurse and she works in rural Georgia. She has these concerns all of the time. And my mother was actually someone who contracted COVID early on in April. And one of the things that was very concerning to my mother is, well, how do I make sure that I cast my ballot? My mother was sick and was worried about June primaries and how her vote was going to count, because what's directly tied to that vote is her health care as someone who was infected, but also the health care that she provides to others as a first responder, as a caregiver. Those policies and protocols are necessary to keeping people safe. And I think overwhelmingly the state of Georgia has not come forward with a clear and comprehensive plan, and neither has the federal government. So where does that leave our citizenry, our people? Well, that leaves them with the power of their vote. So I do think that more people are really paying attention to the issues in their communities and their households around that kitchen table. And as they're listening to these issues and figuring out what to do, more and more people are leaning into this vote. What does voting mean? I think that what voting means to us means something very differently depending on the circumstances that we are in. And in the circumstances that we are in right now, it is very dire that all of us really step up and take an active role in our democracy, because it is one of the most effective ways for people to tell their representatives what they need and apply pressure so that way they get the care that they absolutely need. And our survival is at stake. And so this is why it's so important to voters. And not only that, there's so many other things tied to this pandemic, right? Jobs, not only just healthcare, but jobs and education. How do we effectively educate our children during this moment? How do we make sure that rural people have access to internet access so that way they can have the experience of learning that's required in this moment? There are so many other questions and so many other issues that are tied to this pandemic that are yet unanswered and unresolved. Our voters are stepping up, they're plugging in, they want a piece of this democracy and they want it to work for them. And that is why I think more and more people are stepping up during this cycle.
Klima, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask how your mother's doing now. How is she recovering?
Thank you for asking. She's doing much better. She's back at work, and as a matter of fact, she is the primary person that does the testing at the place where she works, and she is the one that's really taking the lead to keep the patients at her care facility safe. I will say that, a lot about this virus is still unknown, so she still does have lingering symptoms. The lingering ones that we hear are common for so many people who are surviving this illness, and so she still has some of that that's happening. And I just want to be clear to anybody that is hearing or watching that this is a very serious virus. And even if you can come away with it and you've gotten over the hardest part, there are still some lingering symptoms that may stay with you. So I think it's important for all of us to take this very seriously, to remember that it affects us all in very different ways, and to do our best to help reduce the spread.
A really unusual year and an unusual election year, is it not? I'm telling you. And again,
Yes.
Glad to hear your mother's doing better. You mentioned absentee ballots before. I voted absentee in the mail. How do we know that it's going to get there? How do I track it? How does somebody who drops it in the mail know that your vote's going to be counted?
Absolutely. Fantastic question. So I want to just lead by saying that voting by mail is a safe and secure and effective way to vote. It's something that the state of Georgia has done for years. It's something that nationwide, all of our states have some form of vote by mail or absentee voting. So in the state of Georgia, if you've submitted your absentee ballot and now you're wondering the status, has it been received? When was it received? Are there any questions that I have to resolve for my Board of Elections? What you can do is hop onto the Secretary of State website, that's mvp.sos.ga.gov, and there you'll have up-to-date information about your absentee ballot application and about your absentee ballot. So let's say you're looking and you know that you submitted your absentee ballot a long time ago. You have a strong gut feeling that the information on the screen might be telling you something that isn't necessarily true about your absentee ballot. I urge everybody to check with their local county offices. So though that website does provide comprehensive information received by the Secretary of State's office, Secretary of State's office receives that from that local county of elections. So please go go online, check Google, figure out who your county elections office is, where are they located, what's their phone number, give them a call. Sometimes your county elections office may have that information on their own website. So it might be a good idea to see if your county even has a website. Now, I'm not just talking to Atlanta. We know that Metro Atlanta has really robust internet service, but that is not representative of the entire state. So if you are a rural voter and you do have these questions, get their phone number. Call your Board of Elections office. They can give you that information about your ballot. If you still have questions about it, and now we're getting much closer to Election Day, and you have some additional concern about whether it was received, you can show up during this period. So early voting is happening now until the 30th, until Friday this week. So you can still show up at your early voting site. Now you're going to have more sites available to you to ask these questions of your local counties. And you can pick the time in which you can do it because now you have more options. So I do suggest go ahead and go to your early voting site. Go to your Board of Elections office. This democracy, this voting is yours. Your vote is yours. And those offices are for the people. And you are part of people. So please make sure that you hold these offices accountable. You have every right to do that. And they are accountable to you. So hold them accountable. Check the Secretary of State's office. Check with your local county. Get the answers that you need.
But your President Trump, has demeaned and discussed and said mail-in voting is corrupt. How are we to be reassured then that if our president's talking bad about it, that we should believe you?
I think that we should believe the facts. I don't even think we should believe me. I think that we can independently see for ourselves what is happening in the state, and we can decide for ourselves what we want to use as our voting plan. I want to make very clear to everybody that is seeing this today that these are options. The right to vote is for the people. You have that right. You may vote in person on Election Day if you so choose. You may vote during this early voting period if you so choose up until Friday. But if you want to vote absentee, you may do that. Now, we know that President Trump had his own absentee ballot task force some time ago, specific to review these issues. We know that task force did not produce any actual fraud nationwide. We know that there was no, that their investigation didn't actually capture any details of concerning fraud of which voters should be concerned. We know that is not the case. We also know that for the state of Georgia, we have not been presented with actual evidence of absentee ballot fraud. We just haven't. But for those who see drop boxes maybe for the first time and might be concerned about whether that is a safe option for ballot delivery, I do want to assure everybody that is a safe option for ballot delivery. That if somebody wants to submit it either through the United States Postal Service, we know that our Postal Service has so many checks and protections in place to assure that all of our mail, regardless of if it's a medical letter, a postcard, a birthday card, or a ballot, there are protocols in place to make sure that mailed ballots through the U.S. Postal Service are received safely and securely, Same goes with the ballot drop boxes. If you have a ballot drop box in your community, you will have a surveillance camera there 24 hours a day watching who is depositing the ballots and who is retrieving them. The Board of Elections are the ones that are receiving these ballots and that are then keeping them safe for tabulation. We know that that is what's happening. We just do not have any evidence in the state of Georgia or nationwide to support blanketed absentee ballot fraud. So I encourage everyone, please hold your elected officials to account. Please hold valid facts accountable. Please seek out this information. Google is available to most of us. So if you have a question, go to a reputable news site for that information. Check out the Georgia Secretary of State's office. They have press releases that will lay out any information about fraud in Georgia. They do not have evidence of fraud in Georgia. So you can check that out for yourself. That is not an issue here. Voting absentee or voting by mail is a safe, secure, and effective way to vote. And it is a good way to help reduce the spread of COVID-19. If you are able to vote remotely, please take that option. And please know that it is safe. And also, please know, apart from the Secretary of State's office, who is our election administrator, who's responsible for our elections being safe, beyond that, we have coalition partners in the state that are focused on doing this work. So not only all voting is local, but we have NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Black Voters Matter. We have the Pro-Georgia State Table. We have the Coalition for Good Governance. We have a lot of really good organizations that are focused on this work. When it comes to absentee ballot,
SCLC being
yes.
one of them.
SCLC, we have SCLC as a big proponent of ballot safety and securing our vote. And we also know that we have a voter empowerment task force that was formed back in May. And so All Voting is Local is part of that task force, along with some of those partners that I mentioned, including Southern Poverty Law Center and others, because our focus is to also make sure that no one is interfering with absentee voting. And so we formed a task force to specifically make sure that the Secretary of State is not doing anything that could jeopardize the vote, but also making sure that private actors aren't doing that either. And so these are a group of lawyers, voting rights groups, and voting rights activists that are all working together right now. And we have eyes on all 159 counties to ensure that no one is interfering with the right to vote, especially while voting absentee. So rest assured that we have your back and we're collecting this information. And so when we tell you that it's safe to vote absentee, that is because we're doing the research and we're doing this work, but we urge you to find that information for yourself. Fact check me. If you have a question, certainly do so, because we are committed to making sure that all voters have correct and up-to-date information.
Clema, let me ask you this. Haven't there been some fraudulent dropbox stories about that? Does that concern you?
That does not concern me, because part of what we're doing with ensuring that we have safe delivery of ballot drop boxes is to ensure that we are also in good contact with vendors that are providing these drop boxes. These drop boxes are not movable, so they're not something that a person can kind of just grab them and abscond with. They're not. They look a lot like either the library drop boxes that we would use to deposit a library book, or the way that a post office box would look. They're bolted to the ground, they're required to be, and they have to be near a government building, and they must be under 24-hour surveillance. With these checks in place, we understand that this is how we can ensure that ballot delivery using a drop box is safe. They're surveilled, they're bolted down, they're usually anchored next to a government building, and we know that the only ones that have access are those that work for the county offices. They're also locked, so they only go one way. You may only deposit, you may not retrieve unless you have that key to that lock, so that way you can access all of the ballots. So it's very safe. We haven't heard any issues about ballot fraud. We also haven't heard issues about people absconding with the drop boxes or anything like that. But one thing I want people to be very cautious about and to scrutinize is the information that you hear about our elections. I'm happy to talk about the challenges around our elections. I won't tell you that everything is fine and that there are no problems. I won't do that. But I'm happy to talk about the issues, but also talk about the facts related to those issues so that more people can feel encouraged about voting. What I don't want to happen is for people to have incomplete or incorrect information and to base their voting decisions on those determinations. I think we need to have fact-based determinations about our elections. I think that is the best way for us to vote effectively. And even though we are hearing a lot that is disconcerting, I think we have to remember that the right to vote belongs to the people. We are the people. We have to invest in getting the facts, and we have to show up to vote.
You mentioned the Georgia Secretary of State's office. There are those who believe voter suppression is afoot within that Georgia Department of that office. He's being sued by Greg Palast and some others about erroneously taking folks off the voting rolls. Are there concerns about the Secretary of State's office and what's being done there? Are you monitoring that as well?
We are monitoring that as well. And I will say that that is not incorrect to feel like the Secretary of State's office has approved suppressive tactics in our elections. And I say that because we know that during the last gubernatorial election, there were issues with people being erroneously purged from the voter rolls, being erroneously placed in inactive status, making people confused, canceling their ability to vote, and this is voter suppression. And we know that it is even more troubling when it happens in our communities of color, because we know that it's unfortunate, but it is our American history to keep people of color away from the ballot. We cannot ignore that, and that is why we have to take it seriously when we hear that there could be some suppressive activity happening. Because once you start to purge people, place people in inactive status, and you are not accountable to how that methodology is selected, in other words, how are you making these determinations about placing someone in an active status? The first step to purging them from the rolls. We need clarity there in order for us to better understand that people aren't just erroneously being disenfranchised. We know that disinformation, misinformation, confusion, all of these things really breed suppression. So that is concerning, where the Secretary of State's office is not clear about particular practices coming from his office. And I mean practices related to when someone is placed on an active status or how. What's the basis of that research that they use to make those determinations? We need clear guidance there. And where we don't, we know that suppression lies. Suppression can exist and then thrive. And that is not what we want. We do not want people to be disenfranchised. So we must continue to hold the Secretary of State accountable, and these are issues that we're monitoring, not only from the purges, but also looking at polling place closures and consolidations, looking at very long lines on election day because of issues with these voting machines, with the poll pads, with all of that. All of these things are barriers to the ballot. All of these things can be potentially suppressive, and especially for communities of color. So we absolutely are monitoring all of that. And yes, we can call it what it is. It would be suppression.
What are your concerns of the upcoming election day? Election day shenanigans, long lines you just mentioned. This could be a problematic election day, could it not? Or it could be fine, but there are concerns about how many problems might arise.
Absolutely. I think those concerns are valid. I think what we've seen already during the 2 weeks of early voting is an odd mishmash of issues, some of which we've seen during primaries over June, and some of which we kind of didn't expect coming into this early voting period because we thought that critical issues were resolved. As an example, we know the first day of early voting on October 12th, also a federal holiday, but to Georgia is the start of our voting day. We know that was a rough and rocky day because the Secretary of State's office was closed. So where we had county offices, our local board of elections, looking for answers to questions from our poll pads, that device that people use to determine their eligibility when they check in and then receive their ballot card, folks were having issues using those devices because of a software update that we were told that the Secretary of State had rolled out for this election cycle, that we heard was already supposed to be ready for early voting on October 12th. Wasn't the case in many counties. Then when these counties reached out for help, couldn't receive it in a timely fashion because the Secretary of State's offices were closed on that day. So what do those issues mean when we hear them? Well, that means that where a voter would typically have to wait 1 minute to 3 minutes to kind of get that check-in process going so that way they can have their ballot card and continue on to vote, they weren't able to do that. In some instances had to step aside, had to wait for many more minutes while the line continues to grow, where it's reasonable for people to wait maybe 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes with physical distancing and a lot of people showing up. It's understandable that voters have to wait. What's not understandable and inexcusable is to have voters wait 4, 5, 6, 7+ hours to cast their ballots. And it's unfortunate, but in many counties, we still saw those issues during early voting. These are some of the same issues that we saw over primary day. And these are some of the issues that we will likely see again on election day because the Secretary of State's office's response has not really been responsive or effective. On that note, I also want to say that we haven't heard a lot of accountability or responsibility from the Secretary of State's office about these issues. Instead, what we have heard is that, oh, it's the counties, oh, it's the voters, oh, it's someone else and something else, and not accountability and responsibility from that office. We know the old adage, we hear that all the time, the first step to addressing any problem is to address that you have a problem, to admit that you have a problem, to then take accountability and responsibility for that problem. We have yet to receive that comprehensively from our Secretary of State's office. What voters don't need is a false idea that there are no problems, but then to show up on election day only to see that there are problems that they were not prepared for. And if you're not prepared for it, you don't know how to troubleshoot it. And if you can't troubleshoot it, that's going to suppress your vote because now you don't have confidence in the system anymore. Or now you're waiting too long and you reasonably can't deal with any issues that the poll workers might be waiting through. So what I would say is this issue starts at the top. From our Secretary of State's office, it's up to them to address them, to properly respond to them, to make sure that voters are not encountering issues on election day. But hey, to voters, it's not all perfect. We're doing our best. Please show up to vote anyway, even though it's not going to necessarily be the easiest time for you. If you choose to vote in person, please know that you have to allot for time, so bring your patience. If you're voting in person, bring your mask or face covering. Bring your comfortable shoes and bring your faith in democracy because we still need you. So please turn out and vote anyway.
Good point. Faith in democracy. What is the toughest voter group for you to excite, get to the polls, especially in the Black community or the poverty community? Black men? Is it young people? Who's the toughest to get out there and have faith in our democracy?
I think Mondale Robinson from the Black Male Voter Project might agree to some degree that we have been having issues, I think, when it comes to turnout among Black male voters. And I think that's because of everything that's happening. We know that criminal legal reform is an enormous strain for that segment of the population. We know that when it comes from rhetoric from the federal government, it's very unclear as far as what we're doing to address those issues. But we know there's a segment of the population of our Black male voters that are leaning towards Trump and those type of policies. And what comes from that is a lot of suppression as well. A lot that's coming from the rhetoric from that administration is pushing people not to vote. We know that if we pay attention to any of his campaign speeches, he has targeted states that he is not going to visit because he thinks their vote is hopeless. And so I think that coming from the federal government, those messages are damaging for all voters. Period. I don't care what color you are or where you come from, but I think for our Black male voters especially, it's challenging because they are dealing with a lot of other things. And to your point, people who don't have the resources to deal with this pandemic, people who live in poverty, people who are marginalized groups that live in rural Georgia, who don't have access to robust election changes and information as we're laying them out right now. So I am concerned about our black male voters because I know that criminal legal reform and how this system really intertwines them and makes it difficult for them to vote. We understand that some of them might be leaning towards Trump and those policies that could be damaging to the community, but also many of them are disenfranchised because they have felony convictions. And so how do you get someone to understand that once you've completed the conditions of your felony conviction, that you're still eligible to vote, that you can still vote? It's been difficult to convey that message because voters from that particular demographic do not have access to correct and clear information from not only the Secretary of State's office, from the Board of Pardons and Parole as well. So I think the real challenge comes from getting the correct and up-to-date information to the voters that need it the most, the voters that are suffering the most in this pandemic, the voters that are rural, that are not in these communities, that have access to robust information, but voters that were previously incarcerated, who were disenfranchised for a long period of time, who may either feel like their vote doesn't count or matter because their lives haven't mattered throughout the entire time that they were put inside, throughout the entire time that society has pushed them out of the system. So it's understandable for that segment of voter to maybe struggle to feel the value in their vote. But then even if they do, accessing that vote is also very challenging because if you were previously disenfranchised, you may not know how you can then get your vote again. You may not know whether or when or how you've completed the conditions of your felony so that you may register again. I think a lot of that has to do with confusing information not being available to voters. And what's really a shame is that it really impacts voters of color and particularly black male voters in this instance.
Cleveland, we have a lot of media attention on the presidential race, the U.S. Senate race, a lot of conversation about the Electoral College, et cetera, et cetera. But your group is called All Voting is Local. And isn't it true that your local school board race, your local district attorney, your local city council race, aren't those the most important elections for where you live, for where your vote matters most?
I would hard agree. Absolutely. I would say that your local elections are the key to your community. And what that means by they're the key to your community is that they're key to improving your community. You're key to being more active in your community, and you're key to those critical changes that you want to see within your community, that keeping your elected officials accountable. That's how you do that. So when we think about the issues that affect people's everyday lives, right now we're in this pandemic. So access to healthcare, access to public transportation, representation when it comes to police activity, making sure that they are accountable to the people and not the other way around. These are things that are really come up when it comes to local elections. Your local DA races really will determine how you're going to be seen in the eyes of the law in your community. So if you ever are pulled over by a sheriff or police officer or anything like that, and you're wondering about how you're going to be treated at that next level, what's going to happen from that police interaction to then potentially your interaction with the court, well, your DA plays a really big part in that. And you can elect the person that will make determinations and decisions based on your interests. You don't have to leave it up to the powers that be, because you are the power that be, the power that is. It lies with the voter in that community. So when we think about the people that really impact our community, that will determine criminal legal reform, that will determine our school board of elections, how we're going to think about the school to prison pipeline, for example, how we're going to determine how our curriculum shapes up for our students, whether or to what extent there should be in-person learning as opposed to virtual learning. All of these questions really determined by your vote. It's not a matter of determined by these representatives. It's a matter of determined by your community. determined by the people who make up that community. So if you have a question about those things, or you have a concern, or you want to see something improve in your community, then you really have to plug into these local elections, because these representatives will represent your interests. That's what they're here to do. So whether it is your DA, whether it's your elected judge, whether it's your elected sheriff, whether it's your senator, whether it's your congressperson, all of these people are here to represent your interests. Now, it may not feel that way to some, and that's understandable if you've been pushed out of the system, if you were previously incarcerated, if you have a polling place that's shut down in your community, if somehow this information about our elections is so murky to you, so confusing to you. Please know that there are a lot of long-standing issues in our elections in Georgia and nationwide that have made it very difficult for voters. Indeed, a disservice to voters, but we can still step up and make it better. The way that we make it better is by participation. Do not let anything or anyone stop you from saying something about your community, from saying how it ought to be, from saying what you need it to be to move forward and to move in a positive direction. So participate in those local elections. Participate in those municipal elections. They're so very important. Make sure that you have a say in what's going to happen in your community, because it's your community. It's not anyone else's but yours. So please plug into those local elections.
One of our religious leaders just asked, why are voters being threatened? Have you heard about that? She just asked, are voters being threatened from going to the polls?
My goodness. So this is something that I'll tell you we are monitoring. We do want to make sure that no one is threatened to vote, not to vote. No one should be threatened. This isn't something that we've seen overwhelmingly in Georgia. Luckily, we don't see this happening in many places, but if somebody does have any information about that, please reach out to us or reach out to your local voting rights organization that's doing this work, because we're all working together to make sure that voters are safe. If there is a organization or group of people that are threatening people from voting, I think that's because our vote is valuable. I think it's because if more of us participate, more of us can make changes. And if more of us can make changes, then the power dynamics as they currently are will shift, and will shift in favor of the people whose voice matters, and the people who represent the community. Then there's going to be a clearer line between problems and solutions and accountability. And there might be some folks out here who don't want to see that. We know that it's not easy to make change. We know that people have had to stand and to sit and to march and to bleed and to die for our voting rights. And we know that's because once we have them, we're going to push change in our communities. Once we have the right to vote, once we exercise the right to vote, we're going to see some real change. And some people don't want that. So to the extent that anybody is threatened from voting, one, that's illegal, that shouldn't happen, period. Please let somebody know immediately. Call the Election Protection Hotline at 866-OUR-VOTE. That is something that we are monitoring very closely, 866-OUR-VOTE. If you see that, if you encounter that yourself, please let us know, because that is illegal and should never happen. But if you're wondering why that happened because it's effective. That happens because your vote is powerful and people don't want you to do that. They don't want you to change things. What I'm saying is you have the power to change things. If you don't like how something's happening in your community, be empowered to vote. Please do.
Klima Kondaker, how important is this election? What does this mean to America?
This election, I think to America, this has to do with the consciousness of where are we as a nation? Where are our priorities as a nation? I think that is what this election is going to clearly define, but I don't think it's just going to define that. So I'm not going to say that beyond all doubt, that is what this election will represent. I will say that the election will also represent issues that we have to fix in our elections. I think it's a great way for us to collect information about the improvements that we have to make moving forward. So not only is this election important for our not only democracy, for our lives during this pandemic, whether or not or to what extent we're going to have a clear plan on what we're going to do with this deadly virus. That is going to come from this election. But also what's critical is this election is also going to expose issues in our election systems, period. One of the things that we're closely monitoring in Georgia are these new voting machines and some of the problems that we're having with these voting machines. We know that they're not just used in Georgia, but we know that in other states, there has been a far more robust process to test the machines that we haven't seen in Georgia. So locally, we're going to be able to assess a lot out of this election and figure out the improvements that we have to make moving forward. This is a presidential election year, so that's why it's particularly heightened on people's minds. But local elections, municipal elections, these are still going to happen. So elections are going to continue after this point. But when it comes to this election, our lives are on the line. We need to know what we're doing with this virus. We need to know how to protect our families. And we must be able to elect people who will represent those issues, who will care about our interests, and who will put that forward to ensure that we can reduce the spread, we can contain this thing, and we can go back to life.
Klima, you are so articulate, so attractive, so intelligent. Are we going to see out soon? Will we be voting for you one day in the near future?
I am not running for office. I can tell you that. I work in the nonpartisan nonprofit space, and I work in this space because I enjoy getting information direct from voters who trust me and the work that I do and trust the organization that I work with, and also working with our fantastic coalition partners, including the New Georgia Project and ACLU of Georgia, and of course, Southern Christian Leadership, all of these fantastic organizations that do this work. I'm committed to this coalition of organizations that do this work and to the voters. And so because of that, I don't want to realign myself, not especially when it's so important now. I do enjoy having the freedom of being able to do that and speak freely and honestly to everyone. And that spirit is one I don't want to disturb.
Well, we thank you very much for joining us and explaining how important the third is going to be. This has been Sclc Votes, a Klima Kondaker. Get out and vote next Tuesday. I'm Maynard Eaton.